Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to unpack something truly fascinating and honestly a little bit terrifying. We are going to look at exactly how a republic is methodically dismantled piece by piece. And the crazy part? It happens right in front of a cheering public. Between 1799 and 1804, France transitioned from a wild decade of revolutionary republicanism straight into a lockdown, entrenched autocracy under Napoleon Bonaparte. But, this wasn't some magical overnight shift. It was a highly calculated, step-by-step unraveling of democratic systems. So let's get right into the mechanics of how this actually happened.
Okay, let's dive into this. What we're dealing with right off the bat is a masterclass in political marketing. If you look at the propaganda from the time of the 18 Brumaire coup, you see this youthful, idealized Bonaparte, flanked by wise older statesmen. They're literally holding scrolls promising to pay off state debts, bring peace, and inspire a love of the laws. But the key takeaway for us in this explainer is the incredibly stark contrast between this carefully crafted, benevolent savior image and the gritty, authoritarian reality that was actually unfolding behind the scenes. Section 1. Saving the Dying Republic. To understand how any autocracy takes root, we really have to look at the environment that lets it flourish. When Bonaparte and his allies, a group known as the Brumairians, took power, they absolutely flooded the country with propaganda. They claimed they were stepping in to save a dying republic from certain doom, completely scapegoating the previous government, the Directory. And the thing is, this worked. It worked because it contained a massive grain of truth. Public anger was genuine. Officials were reporting that bridges, canals, and harbors were literally crumbling. One scientist inspecting hospitals in Normandy wrote that the sick were lying in torn rags with no blankets whatsoever. Add endless, draining military conflicts and rampant rural crime to the mix, and you get a populace that is desperately, practically begging for strong, orderly change. Yet, despite all those shiny promises of peace and lawfulness, people paying attention saw the writing on the wall pretty quickly. Christine Reinhard, who was the wife of a former minister, captured it perfectly when she noted, "This revolution has a military character. One cannot deny it." And here's a crucial detail. Bonaparte's grip on power was actually super fragile in the beginning. There were plenty of other ambitious generals just waiting for him to slip up. Bonaparte himself admitted that the people governing today could easily be exiled tomorrow. They knew they had to lock down their position, and fast. Section 2. Rigging the new rules. Now, what's really interesting about this next phase is the battle of egos. The conspirators had toppled the old government, but get this, they didn't actually have a new constitution ready to go. This opened the door for some intense constitutional maneuvering. On one side, you had Sieyès, a seasoned political operator. He wanted to create this grand elector role, a purely ceremonial figurehead with a giant salary but zero actual power. He basically wanted to put Bonaparte in a gilded cage. But Bonaparte? No way. He completely outmaneuvered Sieyès. He flat-out refused to be a figurehead, threatened to just seize power by force, and instead created the role of first consul for himself, giving him absolute unchallenged authority over domestic and foreign policy. So Bonaparte had the power, but he still needed to look legitimate to the people. He insisted that the new constitution be submitted to a public vote, a plebiscite. Shortly after, the government triumphantly announced an absolutely massive mandate. Over 3 million yes votes. But let's take a look at the actual math behind that claim, because this discrepancy exposes the foundational lie of the whole regime. The official count claimed over 3 million yes votes and only about 1,500 no votes. But the reality? The actual number of votes cast was only around 1.6 million. Bonaparte's own brother, Lucien, who was acting as interior minister, engaged in some incredibly creative accounting. He literally just padded the numbers by over 1 million votes. Why? Because they needed to claim their new authoritarian regime had a stronger public mandate than the democratic government they just overthrew. The whole thing was built on a massive, fabricated mandate.
Section 3. Crushing the opposition.
All right, so with the rules rewritten and a fake mandate in your pocket, what's the next logical step for an autocrat? You eliminate the rivals and you silence the dissent. You simply can't maintain absolute control if people can publicly criticize you. And the speed of this crackdown was just staggering. By January 1800, they brought back the old system of licensing the press and banned all but 13 newspapers in all of Paris. They systematically wiped out the Republican press. The only publications allowed to survive were those that preached social order, leaned conservative, and knew better than to criticize the first consul.
But the real turning point for crushing the opposition came as a literal explosion. It's a total true crime moment. Christmas Eve 1800. Bonaparte is in his carriage heading to the opera when an infernal machine, which was essentially a primitive car bomb made of a horse cart loaded with gunpowder, detonates right near him. It missed Bonaparte, but it killed several innocent bystanders. Horrific as it was, it handed him the absolute perfect crisis to exploit.
Bonaparte saw his chance immediately. Before anyone even started an investigation, he confidently declared that the bombers were his left-wing rivals, the Republican militants. The historical records captured this chilling quote from him: "Blood must flow. Deport 200 of them and take advantage of this opportunity to purge the Republic of them." He used the sheer panic of the moment to bully the Senate into approving special courts and arbitrary measures, eliminating his political enemies without a single shred of evidence. Which brings us to this wild forensic paradox where hard facts collide with political convenience. The police minister, Fouché, actually conducts a brilliant, surprisingly modern forensic investigation. He takes the remains of the horse from the bombing to local blacksmiths to trace it. The evidence definitively proved the bombers were right-wing royalist conspirators, not left-wing Republicans. But Bonaparte? He completely ignored the facts. He refused to walk back his purge, and he deported over 100 Jacobins to deadly penal colonies anyway. And the crazy part? The true royalist mastermind actually escaped to America. It perfectly shows that for this regime, a convenient crisis was infinitely more valuable than objective truth. Section 4. Imposing order and peace. Let's move to the next phase and see how this builds, because you might be wondering, if the government was this repressive, how did it survive? Why did people love it? The answer is spectacular military victories that totally distracted the public from their vanishing liberties. Bonaparte knew he had to win on the European chessboard. In June 1800, a near disaster at Marengo was dramatically flipped into a major victory. That forced Austria to sign the Treaty of Luneville in 1801. And then, in March 1802, the Treaty of Amiens ended the war with Britain. For the first time in a decade, France actually had peace. These massive, rapid successes made Bonaparte virtually untouchable at home. But, as always, you have to look behind the curtain. While everyone was celebrating these peace treaties, Bonaparte was methodically gutting local democratic control. He completely did away with locally elected administrative bodies and replaced them with appointed officials called prefects. This established a rigid, top-down system. Orders came from Paris, and the prefects carried them out locally with zero debate. Under the disguise of administrative efficiency, it was literally a direct return to the centralized authoritarian style of the old French monarchy.
Section 5. The Saint-Domingue Betrayal.
With Europe mostly quiet and his domestic critics exiled or silenced, the autocracy turned its focus overseas, to the Caribbean. And this is where we see arguably the most profound betrayal of the French Revolution's core ideals. We have two wildly competing visions here. On one hand, you have Toussaint Louverture, the brilliant leader in Saint-Domingue, who drafted a constitution defiantly declaring slavery forever abolished and mandating universal equality, even if it did centralize power in his own hands. On the other hand, you have Bonaparte. The source material is very clear about this. Bonaparte held explicitly racist views on colonial rule, privately noting he was for the whites simply because he was white. His sole ambition was to crush local autonomy, reimpose absolute control, and ruthlessly exploit the colony to fund a global empire. And this brilliantly illustrates the cold, purely calculated nature of how an autocracy deals with any defiance. Bonaparte dispatched a massive force to the Caribbean, commanded by his brother-in-law, General Leclerc. And Leclerc was armed with a secret three-step blueprint for betrayal. Step 1. Lie. Reassure the population about their freedoms just to get your troops in the door. Step 2. Once you're entrenched, drop the act, remove Louverture, and absorb his soldiers. Step 3. Arrest the black officers, shoot anyone who resists, and completely disarm the entire population so they can never fight back again. It was a literal step-by-step guide to reinstating colonial oppression. So look at what we've covered. From a fragile, military-backed coup propped up by totally fabricated votes, to a meticulously centralized police state that censored the press, purged its rivals, and explicitly betrayed its own revolutionary ideals for the sake of empire, the transformation was absolute. Which leaves us with this final lingering thought. If a republic dies slowly, not forcefully in the dark, but right out in the open to the roaring applause of a public completely desperate for order and peace, was that trade-off of liberty for security truly inevitable? Thank you so much for exploring this historical blueprint with me in today's Explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you.